Hello, hello. Today we are talking fantasy defenses, specifically for the fantasy playoffs, the most important time of the year. Which one should you be holding on to, stashing for those weeks 15 to 17? Right here, it ranks them from the best schedule for those weeks down to the worst schedule, just based on the offenses that they're playing. But we're going to rank them in a whole bunch of different ways that'll make sense going forward. But let's start off just like the points per game rank right now is right next to their defensive name. It's just how they've done so far this year. 11 weeks. How good has that fantasy defense been? And it's a little volatile. This is going to change a decent bit just because defenses are very unpredictable. We're going to try our best here. And there's also not too much of a gap. The defense 7 to 12, 14 basically, all average 7 points per game. It's a 1 point per game difference between those 8 teams. So we're splitting hairs here, so we have to look at the more specifics to find actually which ones are the best, rather than just, oh, the Saints are the number one because they have the best schedule. So looking more into it, the two things that I want to focus on top of all the other matchups and injuries, we'll get into that, what's been changing, everything. The two things. One is weather. If you're playing in a dome, it's better for offenses. But if you're playing outside in places around the country that maybe aren't the nicest in December, then that can be an advantage for our fantasy defenses. So I have those teams highlighted in yellow, or the teams that they're playing, like that first one, Giants versus Washington. It's home in New York in December. There's a good chance that it might not be the greatest weather in the world compared to maybe playing in Detroit when they have a dome. The next one is just looking for the quarterbacks. That is the biggest thing when it comes to fantasy defenses. So many of the points come from sacks, turnovers, and quarterback fumbles. There's more fumbles from quarterbacks than there is actually getting fumbles from running backs or receivers, anything else like that. It's mainly quarterback play. So we want to be hunting teams like the Browns, Tennessee, even Minnesota's an interesting one now too, but there's a lot of quarterback play that's not the greatest. So there's some backups like Washington. Are they going to have Jaden Daniels back? Lots of different ones like that to look at. So that's the biggest thing. Saints, another one. Which ones have bad quarterback play or potential bad quarterback play at that point of year, and which ones are injured, like Atlanta takes a little bit of a ding with Penix being injured, all that sort of stuff. That's the big thing. But let's start off with my top 5 based on the schedule, their matchups, and just looking in a little deeper. These aren't going to be a perfect 5 because I will say I would rather stash 2 if you can hold on to it, because it's easier to have a perfect schedule in those 3 games with 2 defenses, and we'll find a bunch of different ways to do that rather than just having 1 defense with 3 perfect games. But with that being said, Houston's pretty close. They will not have any weather games, so that's a bummer. But in terms of their points per game rank, they are the second best defense right now, and their schedule in the fantasy playoffs goes home versus the Cardinals, home versus the Raiders, and then in LA against the Chargers in that beat up offensive line where they are 23rd for fantasy defenses, which is good. Good offense. They have Justin Herbert. You wouldn't really think that, but because of that offensive line problems, that Texans defense could feast again. They've been amazing this year. 3 great matchups, 3 top 10 matchups throughout the fantasy playoffs, especially those first 2 games, really good. So they would be my number 1 team in general for the fantasy playoffs. Number 2 would be the Kansas City Chiefs. They also have the Chargers, but they get them at home. And again, Kansas City, maybe not the greatest weather in December, so playing them at home was really nice. Then they get at Tennessee, a great spot against Cam Ward in that offense. And then they are home again, or not, yeah, home again, but they play Denver. They just played Denver in Denver. Now they get the Broncos and Bo Nix in Kansas City in week 17. I really like that spot. It could be like a must-win game for the Kansas City Chiefs too. Creative defense at home. I don't have a ton of trust in Bo Nix, so even though they are 12th against fantasy defenses, I think it's a good spot for the Chiefs in general compared to a lot of these other defenses. Number 3 would be the Bucks. They're kind of like the last one here that has 3 good matchups in general. So they are 11th in terms of that points per game rank. They'll play Atlanta with Kirk Cousins, so that's a big difference, which they're already 18, so they're not like amazing. They're 25th or something like that in scoring offense. And then we got Carolina on the road in Carolina, 27th, and then at Miami is more middle of the road, but not a bad matchup for the Bucks in general. Then we got two that have more so two really good matchups and then one that's not as good. That is the Eagles and the Steelers. The Eagles have the Raiders, then they go on the road to Washington, hopefully without Jaden Daniels for their sake. That's a big part of this. And then they get at Buffalo. And they're going to Buffalo that last game where the weather isn't going to be good. That could definitely help. Low scoring game maybe, but still Josh Allen, less effective. And then we got Steelers home versus Miami, which I think that is key. Being home in Pittsburgh with Tua coming to town, that's the reason why it's good. Then they go to Detroit. That's not good. But then they get the Browns at home in the fantasy championship, or not at home, on the road, but still bad weather, Cleveland. Pretty good matchup for the Steelers, who are the fourth best fantasy defense right now. Here's how the numbers look if you have the bye week. If you're not playing in round one and only 16 and 17 matter, here's the pure numbers. And I'll get into how we compare teams together if you don't have the bye week right after this. But in terms of the rankings, Houston, again, number one. Even if it's just week 16 and 17, set up pretty well. Number two would be how it is on screen, the Saints. I would keep the Saints as the number two team there. They play the Jets in Tennessee. A key here is the Saints' offense hurts their fantasy defense sometimes because, they're not the greatest. They're often playing from behind. Teams aren't throwing against the Saints as much. They're not a terrible defense. So in a game that could be closer or maybe winning against the Jets with who know at quarterback and then Tennessee, that's our two easiest games the entire season. Those could be good spots for the Saints defense right there. Number three would be the Chiefs. They get Tennessee and Denver, like I talked about. After that, it's a couple other teams that aren't as good. That would be the clear top three for me. Then we get the Lions, Pittsburgh at home, and then they are at Minnesota with J.J. McCarthy there. So pretty solid spot. And then the Giants, very similar there. They haven't been the greatest defense this year in terms of their fantasy points, but I think they're a little better than 31st for sure. They get Minnesota at home in New York in December, with McCarthy there. So I like that spot. Then they go on the road to the Raiders. So two pretty good spots right there for our Giants defense, who in fantasy hasn't been the greatest so far. Looking at how we compare these two teams together, though, or your two teams, these fantasy defenses, if you have the room to keep on to it, I will make this in terms of the ranking for week 15, 16, and 17, and then also pairing it with the other 2 weeks. So pairing week 15 defense with week 16 and 17 combos, week 16 with 15 and 17, and week 17 with 15 and 16. I don't know if that makes sense right now, but it will in a second. So first off, let's show on the screen the week 15 matchups, the best ones, and then next to it, we will show what we just talked about, the week 16 and 17. So if you don't have the bye, but you just have room for two defenses, you can maybe pair some of these together because week 15, the best matchups in general right now for the fantasy defenses, my number one would be the Eagles. They are home versus the Raiders, potential weather there in Philly in December, but I really like this spot. Any defense against the Raiders usually works out pretty well. Number two, right behind that, the Bears haven't been the greatest in terms of that fantasy defense this year, but are set up in general, they're actually not bad, 13th. So they're solid, but they get the Browns at home. The 32nd ranked defense, get them at home in Chicago. Really like that spot. Number three would be the 49ers, home versus Tennessee. 4 is Jacksonville, home versus the Jets. And then 5, the Steelers, like I talked about earlier, home in Pittsburgh. Potential weather there for Tua, that Hawaiian quarterback, that Alabama quarterback, that Miami quarterback. Usually doesn't do too well in the weather consistently. So having them home, top 5 fantasy defense against the Dolphins, think that's a really good spot to pair with those week 16 and 17 defenses if you have the room. This next one, let's go to the week 16 matchups. Who has the best 5 matchups in week 16? And I will show on the screen the best defenses for week 15 and 17. So the best matchups of week 16, the Bills on the road versus Cleveland would be my number one. Chiefs right after that on the road versus Tennessee. The Texans home versus the Raiders. They're in this video a lot. The Eagles away versus Washington if no Jaden Daniels. So TBD. And then the Buccaneers away versus Carolina. Think they're set up really well. And if you want to pair them with somebody, the Steelers in general would be that number one defense for me for week 15 and 17. Miami, like I talked about, and then Cleveland. That's a really good spot. Texans at number 2, Chargers at number 3, Chiefs at number 3, we've talked about. Saints at 4. They still got Carolina week 1, which isn't bad for sure. And then they get Tennessee and the Giants. If, again, I'll say it again, no Jaden Daniels potentially. If Mariota's in there, Washington and the Raiders, the Giants match up pretty well for them. And finally, who has the best matchups in the fantasy championship? And we'll pair that with week 15 and 16 teams. Number one would be the Steelers. On the road versus Cleveland. Really good spot, potential weather spot, week 17 in Cleveland, like that. Seahawks, we haven't talked about them. They're an interesting trade candidate because they are number one in points per game. Their schedule for the rest of the regular season for fantasy, like weeks 12 to 14, set up really well. They get the Titans this week. And then their first two matchups of the fantasy playoffs are horrible against the number one Colts and number three Rams. But then they get the Panthers this last week. So at least in the fantasy championship, on the road there, pretty solid spot. Number three would be the Patriots on the road versus the Jets. Four is the Rams on the road. All these are on the road. On the road versus Kirk Cousins in Atlanta. They're top five defense in fantasy. And then the Saints down here at the bottom on the road versus Tennessee. Still a really good spot for them against Cam Ward. We're pairing that with the week 15 and 16. Eagles will be number one, Chiefs number two again, Texans again, three, Buccaneers with Atlanta and Carolina, and Jacksonville, which we haven't really talked about. But those first two games, not the bad, not the worst. They are eighth best in terms of fantasy scoring, which could be surprising. But they get the Jets at home, and then they're on the road in Denver in December. Decent spot against the Broncos and Bo Nix there. They've been a better than perceived fantasy defense, I would say, so far this year. Jacksonville, great game against the Chargers this week in general. But if you have any questions on this, any trade potentials, any of that sort of stuff, leave some in the comments. I'll try my best to answer. But I hope you guys found this useful in terms of looking at these matchups, looking at the rankings to try to stash and look ahead for the fantasy playoffs. Enjoy, have a good week, and I'll see you soon.